That being said, without further ado, I would like to call upon the Prime Minister to open this debate.
Cool. Thank you very much. Okay, wars are very, very bad, and particularly, thank you very much. Particularly the type of wars that we're talking about. We're talking about situations where there's multiple parties that have like incredibly long claims, often rooted in ideology, in a particular area. What's the problem with these kind of wars is that these can last incredibly long. Like there's an incredibly long time that there's like disputed territory where there's simply a conflict between these two partners because they want exactly the same place. The issue with these places is quite clear. Like, in order to get this place from the other party, the only way of doing that is making sure that the people that live there right now do not live there anymore, and you can put your own people there. This means you want to displace these people. Why is this bad? In times when conflict flares up and it becomes hot, this usually means to general atrocities being committed in order to incentivize people from moving away from these areas. But even in times when these are not hot and these are just general asymmetric conflicts, it still causes like lots of incentives for warring parties to make life in these places worse as possible for the people that are there right now. These are by tactics like harassment, by threats, and random violence in order to terrorize the population. This is also why we see the most brutal ways of doing conflict happening in these type of areas. We're saying that there is definitely an amount of cases that we can stop being active war zones using this particular method. Just a tiny mechanistic thing, how would this take place? This might either be that we split this thing into two, maybe the stronger party picks the original one, or otherwise they might do a blind situation where neither party knows which is the original one, and they will accept it. There might be some cases where for particular reasons one party will not accept this and the war will proceed to continue. This is still a general win for our side of the house. If only a small amount of conflicts are resolved this way, it's a net benefit on our side of the house. Okay, so let's talk a bit about these long-running conflicts. Why do they exist and why are they likely to be solved in this particular matter? So why cannot we just take this piece of land that is contested and split it up 50-50, you get 50-50 in a normal case, and we already live happily ever together? And why do we actually need to use a particular device? One, in lots of cases, these conflicts have been going on for a very particularly long amount of time, meaning that you have now a population that lives there that is incredibly hard to get away because they have built roots there, they have property there, they might have a farm there, it's generally and they're not willing to leave. Also, there's resources that are being extracted, usually by the stronger power in this particular area, that the rest of the country is relying on. If you expect X amount of water, X amount of minerals, X amount of energy to come from this region, you're very unlikely to give it up, because you know that there'll be an immediate shock to your economy, which first of all is generally bad for your own country, but second of all, if you're the politician that gives this up, even a small part of it, you're very unlikely to stay in power, therefore you're unlikely to even try to come to a settlement there in any case. But also a very large reason in most of these conflicts is an ideological reason, right? These are not random spots of land that people care about, it's mainly places that have a historical or ideological significance. Take Kosovo, like a reason that is a conflict is that the Serbian people generally think that this is the start of the nation. There's lots of similar situations in Palestine. You more see it for a religious reason. Armenia and well, I'm not going to say the whole nation because I'm not sure about that one. But they also have a similar thing. Our nation was born literally there. It's now in a different country. We can't give this up because literally our foundational myths of who we are as a people are from here. Giving this up is an incredibly weak move, and it flies into the entire reason why you as a group of people want to be a nation in the first place. So it's very difficult for people to give up these kind of situations. So if we make this split, why are the warring parties likely to accept? Very simple piece of analysis. War is incredibly costly, and it continues to cost money cost all kinds of things all over time. Now, lots of reasons why this is the case. A very big one is simply militarization is highly expensive. You need to have equipment there, you have to have people there that can use this particular equipment, technical staff, you need to have soldiers there, and if the conflict flares up and becomes hot, lots of things get destroyed, people die, equipment get destroyed, that just costs a lot to maintain all over time. But also, there's other kinds of costs as well. For example, in terms of embargoes, there's likely, sides to both sides of the conflict. In lots of cases, both sides get massive trade restrictions because they are present in the conflict, because in the modern war we don't particularly like this kind of conflicts. but also just a massive, incredible amount of human costs, right? First of all, just generally all acts of violence that are unnecessary and cause a huge amount of stress and death and all of that. But also that also has larger knock-on effects. People move away from these areas become economically incredibly unproductive, and like the nation suffer from. If they could resolve these kind of things, like the immense and immediate gain they would get is incredibly massive. That's the first reason why there's a large incentive to accept that. Actually, closing? Open.
If I'm an Israeli and I know that the Palestinians will take down the Wailing Wall, would I be happy with that, having that dimension?
I'm not sure what the Wailing Wall is, maybe you know us. Okay, so, and the second point I think here, as I already mentioned, is there's a reliance on existing resources. The nice thing about splitting these dimensions is the existing resources are not affected whatsoever. We're talking about a new gain that can be potentially made. That means that it's significantly more easy to divide it up. If you right now, you get like $1 million, and then you have to give up 600,000 of that, or even like 99, almost all of it. That's a significantly easier thing to accept than on a monthly basis. Your budget is going to be decreased with 100. That's why it's significantly easier to give this up for any party. Also, what I would like to mention is like the international pressure that exists would be immense in these particular cases, because the solution is so simple. And I think international pressure, which we've exactly seen in the case of Russia, is right now incredibly strong, can do a lot of damage to a country, therefore they're particularly likely to listen. And the pressure is more likely to materialize at the moment. The costs are so low for the existing parties. So why is this a great thing? Stopping war, great for all the impacts given. Also, it gives an opportunity for an individual to make a choice. They can now choose in which particular part of the country they can live. In lots of places where there's an ideological split, gives a large advantage to people because they're locked in simply because of the group they're born in or the particular location they're born in. Okay, last piece of analysis here. Even if not 100% of the people buy into it, just simply a majority, this is still likely enough to stop this particular war. Why? Because you need a lot of resources in order to contain a conflict, especially if it's military. This means that even though there might be some hardliners that really want both sides, or that really want this particular side, the vast majority of the population, which they rely on through donations, through like support, through cultural organizations, all will no longer support them in this kind of conflict cannot endure. For all those reasons, we're very, very proud of them.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for that speech, and now invite the leader of opposition.
Frank, what kind of conflicts do we think this relates to? I don't think this is likely to be accepted in heated conflicts, because there, as Dan has pointed out in their POI, it's more about emotions. It's about not just having that land, it's about the other side not having that land. It's the emotional connection that you don't want, your monument that you're wailing towards, like the super huge fucking wall that's important for your religion to not be torn down. I think you feel like the other side is unjustified. I think this is why heated conflicts is unlikely to be accepted. So I think this is more about frozen conflicts. And I think like most conflicts are actually frozen conflicts where this thing happen. This is because there's less political will to fight, because you run out of resources, you don't have enough soldiers, people just get sick and tired of the war. And I think that at the point where not everything's destroyed, and because we're at the point where not everything's destroyed, and we can still salvage some things, I think this is going to be about like conflicts where not both sides have done mutual destruction, but the one side is probably more dominating, right? I think also this means that you probably have some little attacks, and one side being dominated and the other side just doing like little terrorist attacks or something, because the terrorist attacks are hard to catch. So I think that's what we're actually dealing with frozen conflicts where one side is majorly dominant over the other. Cool. Why we think this is going to lead to big disenfranchisement on two areas. Firstly, economic, secondly, political. We think that firstly on the economic. Because we have specifically two areas where one of them is way bigger. One of them has more political acceptance in general and more acceptance from other countries. Look at, for example, Israel and Palestine. Most countries back Israel and not Palestine. This is not a 50-50 thing. And that's what's happened in most countries, because one country is like the big Western one that you're more economically and politically connected to, because of the way we frame this, right? I think that means economically. Most countries aren't actually self-subsistent. This especially also applies to like frozen conflict zones, because there a lot of supply chains have broken down. A lot of things you like can't use anymore. I think that also you're reliant on specifically global supply chains, especially in those small countries, because you cannot simply produce everything you need there. And I think that means that you largely rely on, like, firstly outside help, but secondly also imports. I think this kind of economic activity is going to happen way less because now companies, at least to some extent, have to choose where to go. Most companies aren't like super big fucking conglomerates that can simply say, you're like a specific person that can only now go into this country. I think that this is just this just takes too many resources to actually send stuff like services over there, because a lot of people aren't gonna buy into going into the shitty version of the country when the good version actually exists. That means that second reason for this why countries are not going to go in there is that it just simply doesn't pay off. Because if you already have an underdeveloped version of a region in a specific country, like this is a self-reiterating mechanism. Because you don't feel like it's politically backed anymore, so you feel like you have to use a lot more infrastructure and a lot more resources to get specifically to that country. But also you have less economic activity than the long run. As soon as one of the companies pulls out and doesn't go in there anymore, a lot of other companies are likely to follow and do the same thing. Simply because if you have more investment somewhere, that's better for you. If you have less investment of other companies somewhere, you also get less good trained workers, less like economic activity, less infrastructure. I think this means that economically you simply less disenfranchised and you have like less trading partners in there. The second layer of this, I'm going to take it like later. The second layer of this is the political and authoritarianism area. In these sort of nations, there's a lot of a bigger chance that authoritarianism is going to be on the rise, specifically in this underdeveloped region of that nation. There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, state building is often a problem in these areas anyway. Because you've been in such a long frozen conflict, you probably have had trouble actually getting a bureaucracy and good government shit in that specific region, right? This means that a full state hasn't probably existed for that long, and right there, and it's pretty fragile, specifically if you want to integrate this. But secondly, I think this is also dependent on like no outside journalistic / political control, because you can now to a large extent only get the stories from like a second-hand stories. If you go in there, you have to choose. You have to choose between Israel and Palestine. You can never just go back to like Israel if you've chosen to be like a Palestine journalist, right? I think this is very restrictive. So I think you in the first place get less journalists in. But secondly, I think that the coverage is likely to focus on the economically stronger country because that's more in the interest of specific companies and also countries who have trading partners there. I think this means that you simply get less stories and less knowledge of what happens in those countries, but also less knowledge of what happens internationally within those countries, because less people and less news agencies actually want to go in there. Before I go on, why this is bad closing?
Sure, let's say this is an imbalanced case. Don't you think this is just better for example, indigenous people of Papua New Guinea who are now left their lives destroyed by deforestation or actively being killed by mercenary groups? They at least are alive, not dead.
Dan's going to deal with that. I know nothing about Papua New Guinea. Cool. I think that those things mean there's less checks and balances of actually knowing what's happening in this country, because you just have less coverage. That means I think it's more likely that authoritarianism is going to be on the rise and successful, because you can't also say this is like an authoritarian leader, we're going to sanction them. Firstly, but secondly, you also get less outside info in this country, which means that you're more likely to be submerged to propaganda. Thirdly, also, I think that nationalism and populism is probably way more on the rise in this country, at the point at which you notice that other countries are pulling out of you, and other countries are not helping you economically anymore. I think there's also a self-reiterating mechanism, because at the point where you have more corruption and a more shady state in the country and more authoritarianism, you also get more refuge of war from those countries. I think this is just on these two areas really bad. I also think that minorities that want to stay in this country are royally fucked, because now they can never access both of their identities. This is bad. Proud to approach.
I'd like to thank our speaker very much for that speech. Now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
restriction of this to say it is specifically only relevant in frozen conflicts. I think actually this is relevant in a multitude of, first of all, I think it's relevant in a multitude of conflicts, because even ongoing conflicts that might be somewhat harder to resolve emotionally still have the same economic and political incentives that Alban is giving you for why war is generally really bad for governments unless they can get significant gains out of it, and a point where those gains are just a lot less significant because you could also get them in a peaceful way. You're probably more likely to do that. But even if you buy their framing of this being about frozen conflicts, note that a lot of those frozen conflicts still can, first of all, turn hot in a very quick moment, and therefore in the long run not necessarily frozen. For example, the war in Georgia was frozen since the 90s, and it's very quickly flared up in 2008. Conflict in Ukraine was frozen for multiple years and spilled into invasion, right? Therefore, I think even if it's true that we only can address frozen conflicts, this is probably still valuable because it still prevents deaths in the future, right? But then let me just go a bit into characterizing what the types of wars that this applies to likely look like. I'm going to do a lot of rebuttal and rebuild the Alban's argument in the process. I think this looks like 4 cases. First of all, I think there's wars that are being fought over conflicts that exist over security interests, right? That looks like strategically important regions being contested by multiple governments, things like conflicts about these islands in South China Sea. That's not affected by this debate because, in the end, you can cross over from these dimensions. I think that's irrelevant. Second, wars about resources, right? You have disputing an area for the access to the minerals, oil, etc. in this region, like Iraq war, invading a country to get its oil. I think that is something that is somewhat affected by this motion, by the fact that these are fixed amounts of oil that you're planning to obtain, or of resources that you're planning to obtain. Once you get more than that, it is significantly easier to strike some kind of deal. It's significantly less incentive to go overboard if you can get those needed resources otherwise, because this is overall disincentivizing war, because it's less important. But even those might still happen. What is the most important is 2 things. First of all, there's ideological disputes of systems where two governments being in one place, right? Something like the Korean War, where both governments take claim to all of Korea, is something you can resolve, even if one side they can resolve with this, because now both sides can basically claim that they have all of Korea, that they have their glorious Korea, right? And not only is this better for the conflict, because we now no longer have the risk of North Korea sending rockets over into South Korea in order to scare it off, and the risk of this re-erupting. We all therefore we have less risk of civilian deaths coming from that, and large warfare in the future. But it also means that people now can choose, right? If I'm born in North Korea and the status quo, and I don't like North Korea, I'm just screwed. If I'm this world on Ogof's side, I can actually choose to live in the South Korean version of Korea, right? Or also vice versa, if I'm really into Kim Jong-un. Finally, we have these ethnical conflicts that we've talked about so far, like the Kosovars and the Israelis. I think those are incredibly bad because they're often long-term and a high risk of flaring up again, because these conflicts are very often instrumentalized to drive up emotions within population and get voter support, right? The response we get to that is that you will not be able to accept this emotionally because you care about the other side not having your important area. First of all, I think that's largely asserted. I am not sure why I particularly care about another virtual dimension. I think this is on the same level as watching a movie where Israel is Palestinian. I'm not sure why this matters to the extent that it does not affect my life. It might matter to a highly religious person. I fully agree with that. But I think those highly religious people are in the minority, and the vast majority of the people just suffer and want this to end, right? I think that the fact that you can now erect in the Israeli dimension of the Palestine, or that in the Serbian dimension of Kosovo, you now can live in your ancestral homeland and have all of your ancestral monasteries and churches and everything and historical monuments intact, is probably going to outweigh the fact that you have some vague knowledge that in some other world this is now populated by Albanians. I think they need to do a lot more analysis of why this is going to care something that you not only care about, but care about so much that you're willing to risk death and violence for it, right? But even if you don't believe that it's something that people want to emotionally accept, I think it is still true that, first of all the reasons that Alban gave you, why as a country and as a citizen, you want to avoid war, because there is a real risk of you dying in that war, outweighs these emotional impacts. But even if you don't believe that, The fact that we have a way of resolving these conflicts non-lethally makes it much more likely it is now an international norm that countries are expected to resolve their conflicts this way, right? Much like what Russia did in Ukraine would have been like internationally accepted 100 years ago, but no longer is now because we now have other means of resolving disputes. I think that likewise, in our alternative world, there would be likely a norm to prevent wars among the major nations of the world, and therefore anyone that objects to this reality split and continues to wage war is much more likely to be hit with like political sanctions, political pressure to resolve their conflict. I'll take a POI from Puzzle.
If their framing of hot conflicts is indeed true, then these are exactly paramilitary groups that are likely engaging in these conflicts who, as people, care about the actions that are being done in the conflict. Why are they not likely to care if you just do it in a separate dimension?
Like, these paramilitary groups are probably still caring, but they now have basically no more targets because the other paramilitaries are presumably in the dimension where they want conflict, or they just both choose the same dimension and can like fight out a war in the paramilitary Thunderdome dimension, and all the civilians can like live happily among each other. I'm also good with that. Finally, they tell us that a split version is going to fail. I'm going to be disenfranchised, therefore underdeveloped. Why do we think this is not true? 3 responses. First of all, note that they start at even strength. If you split Israel now, all the Israeli industry is still there for Palestinians to use, and all their natural resources are still there for them to sell. I think it's incredibly unlikely they're just running it into the ground, unless you believe the Palestinians are just like principally incompetent at business like this. Please, I hope you don't. Secondly, like you still get like we still have disenfranchisement in the status quo as well, right? These minorities that are apparently as powerless as they characterize are likely disenfranchised no matter what, because the majorities are going to try to stop them from getting too powerful and going to try to deprive them of resources. Therefore, it's probably better if they live in a slightly less developed state, but are no longer oppressed. Finally, I think this also takes out points on authoritarianism, because I think the large scales of that comes from whipping up people in frenzy against each other. That's much harder to do when the other people are gone. Practical tips.
I would like to thank that speaker for that speech, and now call upon the deputy leader of opposition.
Shout out to everyone who was super supportive today and yesterday. You know we are. Woo! Not you, Peter. I hate you. Panel, let me start off with the weighing of Paula's speech because I think it's completely devastating, it's completely missed by all multi-emoji. One, what we have explained to you is that basically on scale it is very, very unlikely that opening government can claim that most of the conflicts will be solved on their side of the They concede this. They say a vast minority of the conflicts will be explained. We will tell you that this will be such a massive minimal amount which never weighs up against the incredible amount of conflicts that will not accept this and find themselves in a way worse situation. First, why this is about frozen conflicts. 2, why you are less likely to get help from others and find solutions. 3, why disenfranchisement massively decreases for minorities, all rebuttal will be integrated. So why is this about frozen conflicts? So firstly, just empirically, I hope you all read newspapers, they're just the most numerous and likely. That's to say that most conflicts tend to be super asymmetric. This is for the reason that it is just very, very unlikely that you both have the exact same strength. At some point, one of the parties gets the edge over the other party and is then basically able to prolong it for a longer amount of time. That is to say that both parties at that moment kind of stop fighting, because only in like symmetric wars where every life and death, every time of the day matters in order for you to win that conflict, there they keep fighting. This is not the case for most conflicts in the world. Think about Nagorno-Karabakh. By the way, all the others Azerbaijan. Think about Kashmir region. These are the most conflicts that you're likely to see in the world. Why will heated conflicts then not accept? Dino is super uncharitable here. He says that we assert this. Here are 4 structural reasons, shout out to Nikki, why you're not likely to. 1, you know that you have simply a feeling that the land is fundamentally theirs. You know that Palestinians will take down the Wailing Wall, which is like a super cultural importance of the Israelis, in their dimension. At that moment you feel like it's completely illegitimate that they're even on the floor of your ancestors. Secondly, we tell you both sides are likely to still see an optimism bias. They think they still might win the conflict and they still have that land on their own, which they both feel like they completely deserve. 3, you don't see the other's claim as legitimate in the first place. You think that these people should have never entered your land in the first place, therefore you want to get them off as soon as you can. But 4, even if it would be an objective better decision, The decision making you do in the wake of a war simply at that moment is emotions trumping your rationale. Namely, at the moment that you're in war for such a long time, you get such an agony against the other side, then you basically at some point forfeit any kind of engagement that you want to do with them. What does it mean? That does not mean that opening government can claim that they're going to prevent bombings on their side of the house. Simply because those conflicts were likely to still prolong. What we tell you is this is about conflicts that had little violence to begin with, and that leads to incredible disenfranchisement. Why? Because they're likely to make the wrong decision and simply decide to go for that separate dimension, even though it's not the best for them. A, because there's political popularity on the short run, in which you can simply say, look, we're reclaiming the land. But on the long run, at that moment, you basically lost the people and you get disenfranchised. Paul's analysis. But secondly, it's just a super easy message to sell, and people don't think about this in the most rational way possible. Piotr, this is not about Papua New Guinea. The motion says, by governments. This is not about that. Also, I don't think Papua New Guinea is going to accept the other side. So, why is that super bad? Because at the moment, now let me explain to you in the scenarios that you do accept and you don't accept. In scenarios that you don't accept to build up a separate dimension, you will basically be fucked. Why? Because other parties are very likely now to see this as an excuse to forfeit the help that we otherwise would have given to the state. This leads to less support from your allies at the moment that you decline. Why were they likely then to say to stop supporting? Well, for the simple reason is they don't see it as a necessity anymore. They can't sell to the local population anymore. We need to act now because otherwise people are going to be dying. Therefore, we see that it is way less easy to sell to your local people, to your domestic support, that you want to keep supporting there. Although this is super necessary, because otherwise this frankly leads to one side becoming super powerful and basically make people die there, which you think is super harmful. But also in the lower skills, right? If we think about things like alternatives, such as power sharing agreements in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we think those things are possible in our side of the house, and we think even if our opportunity to do that is limited, it at least is better than basically completely shutting down an option and leaving that country incredibly disenfranchised. Before I'm going to talk about why disenfranchisement will happen, Piotr?
Yeah, where does the legitimacy and the mandate of the state come from?
Come on. No, the legitimacy and the mandate of the state comes from, if you want to run state power principle, I would find it lit. I don't think it's necessarily a debate-winning case. I think at the end, your legitimacy basically comes from state provides something for you, you provide something for the state. I'm not Croatian enough for this. Cool. Disenfranchisement in cases where they do agree on the split. This basically means that, as we tell you, there is likely to be a massive asymmetry in terms of the power that these have. Why? 1, it's factual. 2, that's why they are basically not fighting on a daily basis. But 3, there's basically resources mismatch in which one side is likely to have the resources over the other. What does that then mean? We tell you that disenfranchisement goes on a couple different ways. We tell you firstly, now companies and states have to choose which one they see as legitimate and basically go to visit. Dino then says, okay, but you have a short term and have an even playing field. No, because others are now going to have to choose between. That is to say, you cannot deal with both anymore. That is not to say, so they say that on both sides you will get disenfranchisement. I don't think this is very likely, because on our side of the house, you can still trade with both these sides. You can still provide for both those sides. You can still give humanitarian aid at the moment that shit hits the fan in the dimension. Under their side of the house, there will simply be a massive amount of countries that cannot even act at the moment that shit hits the fan in that dimension, because that dimension is simply does not exist to them. We think that is incredibly problematic, because that means that even if they are likely to prevent some kind of war and fighting, we don't think that weighs up. Why? Because we tell you, fighting in conflicts is absolutely terrible, and we're happy to take that. However, we say that the alternative is basically that you are likely to run dry of economic resources, which is just as problematic, because it's a more slow process, but in the long run it's way more likely to harm way more people. Because under their side there is still an opportunity that something gets done on the war, that something of a power sharing agreement can come there, and under their side it's simply not possible at all, because basically you've already forfeited the right, you've already shut it out. Finally, on minorities then. Government says, okay, but is likely to say, okay, but you can opt out of something that you like. 1, I don't think there is likely going to be an agreement on we're going to give minorities their separate dimension, because basically there is no necessity to. 2, there are minorities on both sides, especially at the moment that you're going to be in a deadly decision that you have to choose which of the dimensions you're going to live in. Then basically that means that half of your friends and family you will simply never see anymore, because basically they live in a dimension that is literally unknowable to you. I knew it's unknowable in a bit. But finally, that also means that in the long run we can still do better stuff. Because what we prove to you is this will only shut down frozen conflicts, which are not that problematic anyway. Hot conflicts will get so much worse, and because I'm incredibly proud to stand here with this amazing friend of mine, please vote for Hot.
I would like to thank that speaker very much for that speech, and now call upon the member of government.
Usually Don isn't this wrong, but tonight they are because we're gonna win with the same power principle. Cool, the same power principle. What is the same power principle? So the idea is that the government has a significant control over the groups of people, and therefore the people are losing a lot of the liberties and choices that they have in their life. This is due to the situation under which these people are born, because they do not have a choice that they are within this situation. They did not consent to be born into this situation. What this is creating is that there's a duty to the state to actually provide people with this necessity that is there. This is especially important into the cases that we are actually talking about, because we are talking about a group of people where there's consistent groups of people being left out into the discussion. Because any solution that opening opposition can find for the Palestine-Israel conflict is going to lead to displacement, is going to lead to people being unhappy into the situation. Any solution that can be created is always going to be significantly making the situation worse, significantly taking the rights of the people away more within, which is why the state power principle specifically in this case is so excessively important. Why do we care most about these groups of people, specifically that we care more about them than the economy or whatever other people wanted to run here? Cool. Number one, because they're the people who are the most proximate within this situation. Any choice that is going to be happening is necessarily going to impact them. We do not know how trade routes are going to be happening if we are solving the Kashmir conflict through doing those two things. We do know that there is going to be a group of people that is going to be very unhappy, has the choice about this taken away into this. But then, second of all, they're also just generally the most affected. It is very often in life a decision that is created for these people if they decide to choose within the situation. So we believe that it is the principally only acceptable way to be choosing this, because a perfect alternative is never going to be happening. Because government opposition can come up and, well, we are unhappy that it feels wrong that something is going on in this situation. Well, the people in the West Bank also think that it is wrong that they are being bombed. Like, this is the situation that this is here, because we care so much more, because the unhappiness is significantly lower. Because fair enough, maybe you feel bad what is happening with the wall in a different reality, but at least you can go to that wall in your reality without the risk of being bombed within the situation. So the unhappiness is significantly lower. But second of all, also, whatever is going to be happening, there's going to be somebody unhappy. So it is a way up that is going to be happening. Does it bother you more that you can't see the wall, or does it bother you more that you are being bombed? Third reason, there's less political capital to be a militia that is fighting into this situation, because you have solved your issue. You now actually have like a united Sudan that is happening into the situation. That is unlikely to have more of this war. Fourth of all, you feel illegitimate. I can't even read my writing there. Continuing. Cool. Why are we actually creating significantly more choice on our side of the house? Because we do not know whether or not there's going to be found a solution on either side of the house. But if there is this, but this is like the only way in which we can find this solution. Like, first of all, exclusivity of the model that this is creating. But second of all, it is the only solution that necessarily creates that. Because all of these fights are, by definition, about land, and you do not have the land twice. So any solution is going to push away people into the situation. So this is a choice that otherwise would not be existing. Therefore, we want to use this machine over any other solution of creating solution. But third of all, we are opening up borders where this is happening. Because even if we find a solution that is going to be that, you're not going to suddenly be able to choose both. If we are creating a two-state solution, there's going to be a big wall between this, a lot of border controls, possibility that you're not allowed to enter Israel if you have a Palestinian stamp in your passport that is creating within the situation. We are creating a system in which you can actually choose between the two options, where you can choose where you are, and not that you are just on the wrong side of the border, once again, into the situation. Cool. Why do we care so much about this choice, and why it is so important? But first of all, closing, opening.
So all this analysis can only work if you actually prove that you actually have this political capital, which we prove is simply not there.
We do. Political feasibility. Motion says that we have the political capital to do the splitting situation kind of there. But also, like, people want to find a solution. South Korea and North Korea are discussing a solution for a united Korea. Israel and Palestine are discussing a solution in order to be doing this. Like, there's a lot of this. This is also where New Guinea is relevant, because there is a discussion between the state of the native inhabitants and the state that is within Papua New Guinea happening there. So there is an incentive for them because like opening government isn't completely stupid. What they're saying is that people do not want war. Like for all of these different reasons, there is an incentive to actually find a solution that this is going here. But then second of all, also like at the point that you chose Israel over Palestine, you just can't fuck up the other area anymore. So like also that. Cool. Why is this choice so incredibly important? Number one, you do not consent about being born within this. We are perpetually breaking the consent of this group of people. Why do we care so much about consent into this? Because basically it is the only way in which people can actually protect the liberties that they have within their life into this situation. At the point where we are stopping breaking their consent, we are starting to give these people the opt-in in order to create liberties, in order to have the choice about this. We care about this group of people so much and about making this choice so much because it is culturally so deeply entwined into this. Because like a lot of the solutions could also be like, hey, let's displace them. Why? It's just a piece of land. It is not just a piece of land to this group of people, because this land is connected to your heritage, to your history, this, where the people you're related to come from, where all of your history happened into this. So this is like something that is just unfortunately exclusively within there. So the only way how we can protect the culture is by giving the people the choice about choosing where their culture. So why is culture so proximate to people? Because number one is it's the way of how you grew up. It is something that shaped your identity, that has happened within this, and also how your whole idea about what you want to be, who you are, and how you think is being shaped by into this situation. Because the land is so much linked to culture, we are only giving people the choice about culture if we are giving them the land within this. So why is our case debate winning? I mean, obviously Piotr's going to tell you this, but also four reasons about this. Number one, it doesn't matter if we solve the conflict whatsoever. We have brought you multiple reasons as to why this is exclusively the only version in which we can fulfill the state power principle, in which we can give people access to the culture that they deserve and that they need after so many years of having their consent consistently broken into the situation, something no other solution could ever solve. Number one, we prove the impact on the most vulnerable stakeholder within the situation. We don't give a fuck about the economy at the point where there's so many people who will never actually access the economy, who will never access trade routes because they're caught within a conflict where they are caught in consistent suffering that this is creating. Third of all, we give people a right that they never previously had, all of the analysis I gave. And fourth of all, the rest of the debate is not mutually exclusive. The issue of the economy is going to be happening. Sudan is going to be economically struggling on either side of the house. Ours is mutually exclusive. We back to
I would like to thank that speaker for that speech. A quick reminder to the audience to please do not whisper, because we can actually hear quite a lot from the audience as well. And now the floor is for the member of opposition.
Panel, let's step out of debate land because all the other benches are only dinos and have spent way too far there. A couple of things in mind. One, Papua New Guinea is not a war zone. Not part of this debate. Two, in terms of what this debate actually is, it is assuming feasibility in war zones. That is to say, assuming feasibility. If we take government at their highest ground and say that it is enacted, we're going to show you why wars exist either way. Thus, they don't solve anything, they only temporarily defer it later on. 5 structural reasons. 6. 1. You need people to rule over. That is to say, people in power are generally interested in ruling over other people. There is a craze for power that people generally like. Thus, even when you split, the people in power in each of the separate regions are likely to take control and make dichotomies there as well. Secondly, power and wealth. At the point at which you consistently want to have as much capital or as much power and influence in particular regions, you're still likely to generate conflict at the point at which it comes at the expense of literally everybody else. 3, there's an arms incentive at the point at which it's a huge corporate scheme in order that you're able to spend, sell a lot of weapons. You're still likely to perpetuate conflicts from richer companies and richer countries. Corporate structures still exist on their side of the house. 4, you have superpowers that like tension. Literally look at Bosnia, where they have 3 separate fucking governments and nothing fucking works. Like, I think at that point, superpowers are still likely to have this on their side of the house. 5ly, non-homogeneity always exists, insofar as you are still likely to find disparities that exist. Notice, panel, most conflicts are not about land, despite the fact what CG asserts. Most conflicts are about literally everything else that is put off as conflict about land. Most are about history, most are about culture, but more importantly, most are about money and power. And at that point, it is much more likely that you're still going to have other ethnic tensions or other ethnic divisions that still exist that you're able to non-homogenize into conflict as well. I also want to quickly note, most conflicts are not dual ethnic, they're probably multi-ethnic.
ethnic, so splitting them into two things doesn't really do anything, because the Croats are still there with the Serbians in Bosnia. That doesn't really help much. You still get another genocide. Sixthly, about history. I would argue that in a lot of instances, you still have a lot of historical connections to a particular, like historical hatred towards particular people, thus it's still likely to happen. Notice what this means for the comparative and why this isn't derivative to OO, because OO just says, oh, well this won't happen in particular regions. I don't give a fuck. In the case when it happens, you're still likely to get conflict on their side of the house. And these conflicts will exist either way. That's what this is proving. It's proving that irrespective of whether they actually get their impact, you're going to have, maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, a conflict that exists either way. This means that the margin between the two sides is very, very narrow. And opening half really pisses me off because they don't really engage with this. 2 then extensions on our side, because this is where I want to step out of debate land. If you have a policy like this, it is likely to take a lot of time. There's a couple of reasons for this. 1, you're likely to have negotiations between different parties insofar as what are the conditions for this thing splitting up. 2, you're likely to have talks and agreements about the technology and the way this works. 3, you're likely to just have summits insofar as what are the international relations between a new dimension and other countries like the United States or China. This means that the process of breaking up, or process of splitting up, takes a lot of time. What happens in this time? I just want to instruct an example that existed in most colonial regimes, but the one that's closest to me is India, Pakistan, where literally it took so long for them to change, for them to split the country, that people were scared. There was fear, and in the short run, there was immense violence. There's a couple of reasons why this leads to violence. 1, you are worried that you will choose wrong. Insofar as you're worried you will choose wrong, you're skeptical about what the future holds, and thus you're likely to revolt. 2, you are worried that you're misguided by a government. I don't have any clue whether the governments are telling me good things or bad things, and whether if I go to another dimension, I will be alive or not. I have no idea. This is some fancy new technology that the CEA is made of, so I'm not sure what actually is impacted. 3, I think that fine, OO makes sense here. Like, you have hatred for the other community, thus you're still likely to be scared and have violence later on. But it's not because of, like, all those reasons. It's about the reason that you are scared that the other community will get away with doing the kinds of things to the land that you find really, really important to yourself. What does this mean? It means 1, you're likely to act out preemptively against the group that is going into a different dimension. This is exactly what happened in most colonial regimes when you were really, really worried and scared about what the fuck was going to happen in the near future. 2, you're also likely to act out against the state. You're likely to act out against the police. You're likely to act out against other government places. This structurally means that not only do you harm people, but you also harm the state's ability to prevent the harm for people, which is also taking down the principle from CG. Because at that point, you don't allow the state to be able to exercise its will onto the people, which is exactly what it wants to do on CG. The second thing is, again, stepping out of debate land, you are likely to tear a lot of communities and families apart. Insofar as I need to now choose whether I go with my Dutch mom or my Indian dad. They're both Indian. I think that these familial connections are likely to be super hindered. This is also true not only for your family, but also for your friends, also for your community. You need to weigh off the idea of whether you're going to study in a particular place, whether I have to go to this miserable country, or whether I can go back to Slovenia. The individual impact then is very simple. You are emotionally harmed as fuck because you are unable to understand what your actions actually imply for you yourself, but it also means that it tears families and communities apart. It's a direct emotional harm that you can lead from this motion, because notice that this is significantly worse than colonial regimes. Even people from colonial regimes can cross the border sometimes. You know, it's not that easy, but you can still do it in the worst possible or in the best possible instances. On their side of the house, if you read the info slide, you are there forever, which means you will never see your family again. You will never see the people you love again. You will never see your community again. It's end of time. I'm sorry, I would have taken over, which didn't ask anything. The second thing I want to say is extending quickly on opening up. They say that it's likely because of economic and political, there will be economic and political differences between these two countries, and the reason they say is, but there's an issue because Israel is supported by the most of the world anyway, thus it's likely that they're going to be supported exponentially more at the point in which it's different dimensions. Not really sure what the margin is here. Probably Israel is better off on either side of the house. What is likely the margin when you have two different dimensions is the following. 1, it is likely to be divided on ethnic lines. I think this is broadly the premise of GovCase as well. But this means that if you look at the past, it means that one ethnic group was structurally discriminated against as opposed to the other, which means one ethnic group is likely poorer. One ethnic group is likely the one that does not have the same amount of capabilities or education. This means when you are structurally removing them from everything else, it's likely to get a whole lot worse. You are structurally segregating those who are already marginalized as who are unable to access any of the benefits that come from the vast majority of other individuals. For those many, many reasons, CEO.
I'd like to thank our speaker for that speech. Now to conclude the government side of the debate, the floor is for the whip speaker.
Any action is a principal action. At the moment you make a decision, you actively weigh off what you should do based on the principle that you believe in. That is why we don't really care about consequences. Oftentimes you have specific duties, or we say this one is you have the possibility to choose which state you are able to get into. You think this is intuitive because, for example, you don't kill homeless people, then half their organs, even if you could save more lives. That's to say, it inherently goes to the bodily autonomy and therefore the possibility of choice of the individual, even if the outcomes are better. To that extent, we give them the possibility of choice, that's what I'm going to do. 1. First, exchange bottle to CO. 2. Why everything else is speculative about war, genocide, and all those kinds of things. What is the case of CO? The case of CO is, okay, there are going to be peace talks, and because there are going to be peace talks, there's going to be fear, and now there's going to be like new fear, because now there's a possibility of you choosing more. 1. There's also going to be fear and distrust, and the rest of the house is you're going to have peace talks, as OO is trying to say. That's to say, if you want to have a three-state solution, like as in Bosnia, you're also going to have that fear. That is not comparative. Arguably, you're much more likely to execute this as a hopeful one. That is to say, you now have the possibility to have access to land, but also the likelihood of you having access to more land and having no like wars because you cannot cross over is significantly higher. Therefore, you're unable to actually prove a tipping point here, but also if there's going to be this harm, it's going to be happening on the both of the house. And that is going to be a slow short-term harm, because that means that you're most more likely to, in the long term, at least have some solution and therefore have some possibility to do so. But thirdly, to the extent that governments want to do this efficiently, in the sense that they don't want another war, they don't want another genocide, most likely they're going to do this well. To the extent that governments were significantly able to quickly deal with COVID and have implemented in place, and we see that there's a possibility to do so, most likely things like the UN are going to be doing this quick, governments have this incentive, or you're going to at least have, I don't know, some borders where there's a possibility for you to cross over. Actually, take a shirt, seal.
Yeah, the tipping point is when you have peace talks on our side of the house, maybe there's peace. On your side, there's two different fucking dimensions that nobody really knows about.
Okay, 1. To the extent that you're going to do this is most likely going to be a part of peace talks. That is to say, you're going to say, what are the opportunities that we have to solve this? If this is the only opportunity to solve this, then you're going to still frame this as peace talks within your country. To the extent you do not want another war, or you don't want more terrorist attacks, you're also going to communicate in the media that this is going to be the case, then most likely you're going to discuss this maybe between closed borders, behind closed doors and those kind of things. I truly don't think that they are that comparative. Then, what do we then say? Okay, we say all other things in opening half are very speculative. They say, maybe it's likely that you're going to have less investment and less relationship with the other one. We say, firstly, like maybe you have less cost, as OO says, like because of military, and now you have maybe some possibility of trade, but maybe other countries do not also want to trade with you because they do not like you. To that extent, I do not know whether actually possibility for you to create good economics. I generally don't know because, 1, IR is fucking complicated. Many people have many different motivations, different countries have different ideologies, and if you believe OO, they're not even that rational. That's to say, they're beholden to individuals who have their own personal beliefs and ideology and who are voting emotionally rather than rationally, which means that they're much more likely to maybe want to invest in these countries, maybe they don't want to invest in these countries. To that extent, I do not know what is going to be likely to happen here. But secondly, I also want to note that there is just inherently like a lot of difficulty with the global economy. We don't know how like economic companies are going to like deal with these things. To that extent, neither teams can really say that there's going to be one of the other. Why is still from extradition bottle to OO? They say, you're not going to want to do this because they're now going to kill your whaling wall. 3 reactions. 1, you can just create the copium. That is to say, you can just tell yourself, no, we have the true whaling wall. We have some capacity, like we have some possibility to make yourself feel comfortable because things. Again, the state can assume like we have the original land and the other has the unoriginal land, and the Palestine can do the exact same. You think there's a possibility to do there. Secondly, also the reason that you care about the whaling stone is because people have been telling you that it has this specific historic and cultural context. To the extent that you know, like, there is no real ontological sense that you can just look at the whaling stone and then know that this is the real one. To the extent you have some possibility to then still talk about this in this sense, the possibility for you to get access to the benefits you talk about is still possible. Thirdly, note that you're going to say, like, the reason why the whaling wall is so important because you have some form of getting access to God. To the extent that this is still like the same thing, or you still have a whaling wall you can go to, you can then still like contact God, like tell what this is. If you're not going to say, but Palestine that might bomb this, then you go like, okay, good, then you believe that God is going to send them to hell because they're heretics, much less likely than say, because now you still have the possibility to use that specific thing for the culture that you want, you're less likely to actually want to hate them as much. Therefore, we don't think this is as tensions. But then we get to a point about familial connection, which is already an O and has CO calls an extension. One, we say, firstly, most likely there are going to be some regions in which you're able to have crossover. That's to say, to the extent that you want peace in the first place, which is why you want to go to the negotiation table, and why there is political feasibility, you're much more likely to create spaces in which there's a possibility for families to actually come up and hook up and have the possibility to make the choices. Secondly, the fact that there is now a passport that you can have to go to another country already makes it significantly more likely to have the choice in the first place. That's to say, in the comparative, you're dying and starving because there are terrorist attacks in your country, you don't have access to your culture, you make it significantly higher. But thirdly, we say, to the extent that you have they talk about, there is such hate against these groups, we think that familial mixing is significantly unlikely. That is to say, if there's already going to be norms in society that you hate a specific group, there's already going to have segregation. If you're going to have fear-mongering of the other group, we think it's very, very, very unlikely that you're going to have Israel and Palestine families who are going to be combining together. Therefore, the group that they're talking about has other alternatives, has some likeliness to do so, again, because the government has incentives, because it wants to create this peace. But also, again, the group is so significantly small, we do not care about this, about the overall community, which is they talk about the minority of the minority of the minority, we just talk about the minority, which is generally bigger than the minority. Okay, then, why do we then still take it, what else do we get? From we get, there's going to be a lack of support, because now you are unable to justify this towards your country. One, to the extent that Islamic countries are supporting Palestine because of Islamic reasons, they're still going to, they're still much more likely to, still fight against, I still give this to this, because you see them starving if they don't do so. No, there's still some possibility to have news coming from both sides, because you can just have journalists, one going to the other measure and to the other measure. There's still some possibility to discuss both Sudan and, for example, Zimbabwe, because they're two different countries. You now don't see these two dimensions as just two different countries. To that extent, you're also able to trade. That is to say, some company can just have some cargo ships which then go into, I don't know, South Sudan, and then another one to Sudan. You just need to hire people who have chosen one of those things. To that extent, trade is still possible, and you do not need to make the trade-off. To the extent that people are still able to talk about, for example, Israel, and also about Zimbabwe, because they're two different countries, and you're not going to see these two dimensions as just two different countries, you're still going to have some political engagement. You're still going to have some media coverage. To that extent, we have the higher likelihood of the thing that we're talking about. That is to say, you get the possibility of choice. Say that's inherent to the motion. This is the most clear thing that you can have in debate, where all other things are just speculative debate and things. We think this then gives you access to the most proximate thing, right? Because Hannah talks about why it's important. Culture is the most proximate to you thing ever. It is the thing that makes you who you are. It's how you act and the memories that you have. This is something that you engage with on a daily basis. This is why there are martyrs willing to die for their religion and culture, because they care so much. For all these reasons, for all these principles, vote CG.
I would like to thank that speaker very much for that speech, and now to conclude the debate, the floor is for the opposition with
I finally have an excuse to shout through a room. I haven't been used to. On CO, we don't split families up for no reason. If you have a Bosnian mom and a Serbian dad, it's a lose-lose dilemma for literally every single party involved. And it's especially bad at the moment you incur these harms, when the harms that government is trying to prevent through doing this is inexclusive and is going to happen anyways. Note that, direct responses to OG, even if you split these areas up, war within the split is going to be inevitable anyways, right? For example, if we had split up a bunch of land 300 years ago, the disputes within those areas would have still happened because people by definition are not the same. 3 reasons why war will still happen under Gov's side of the house. Firstly, people are not homogenous, right? You can divide Islamic and Jewish people up, but within those religions, you can still fight about disciplines. Within that, you can still fight about interpretation, and then you can still fight about race, and you can still fight about gender. There's always going to be a new battle to pick. But secondly, note that self-selection is not conducted on the same metric because not everyone scales their decisions on the same things, right? For example, the people weigh their own differences very differently. So one person might think sharing the same race is the most important, whereas for someone else it might be religion, for someone else's personality traits. For me, it's how much you like Taylor Swift. But this means that even if you choose the divide you find most important, given that it's not the same divide that other people choose their division in, that means that other people, that even when you choose a dimension, that means other people might still not accept you there. So for example, if I pick a dimension based on my socioeconomic status and how I think I will be accepted most there, but people with a similar socioeconomic socioeconomic status as me don't like me because of a different race, boom, you're still likely to have these tensions anyways, given people are intersectional and we're not defined by one trait that binds us together, we're defined by literally zillions of endless traits that divide us apart, right? So we think in that sense you cannot avoid this conflict anyways, it's entirely inexclusive. But thirdly, know that these disputes by definition are often not over land itself as the underlying motif, right? They're often about the exertion of power over others. So giving them land often doesn't satisfy or satiate this, meaning they're likely to fight anyways. Know that the Taliban is really not going to be happy having Afghanistan if there are no people there to rule over and it's just a barren land. This means that they themselves are unlikely to go to all the same dimension in the first place. They'll likely also send people to both dimensions on either side of the house because in order to conquer, right? For example, think about all the empires in history. The moment that they've conquered their entire continent, they've never stayed on that continent. They've always gone to a different continent to conquer again. So we think for all these reasons, all these parts about preventing harms and choice on side government are entirely inexclusive because you're trying to solve a problem, but the same problem is only going to exist anyways. At best, you delay it. Now, why does our extension on tearing down families and communities win this debate then? Firstly, know that there is no way to circumvent these impacts, right? Because there are always linkages between people that you are never going to be able to avoid. For example, the issue with East and West Germany is that families are torn apart and unable to access each other, and that opportunity isn't presented for the same reason that under their side of the house, you have to make a choice and you're bound to that for the rest of your life. I.e., I love my sister, but she loves my boyfriend, and she loves her boyfriend, but her boyfriend might be very homophobic, so I'm very unlikely then to go to the same dimension as her boyfriend. But then the question goes, in which dimension does my sister go at the moment that she's torn between two decisions that she really wants, as well as two harms that she equally does not want? These are a series of dilemmas within these linkages between people that are always going to happen under side government, right? And these conflicting allegiances exist throughout all societies, but especially those in conflicts where the line is already blurred within power dynamics, but especially within multi-ethnic conflicts, which is the vast majority of situations that these disputes are about in the first place. And it's simply not possible to account for all of them, given you split dichotomously, and you can't split based on each individual person's personality, because then we're all in our own dimension. I think that'd be a very lonely life. That means that under government of the house, you're forced to make lose-lose choices. But secondly, not everyone will choose dimensions based on the same variables. So a queer individual might choose a dimension that is safest for his sexuality, but still face discrimination because he is too brown. Because the things that make us and being included within one in-group is by definition something that makes us excluded in someone else's out-group, right? So you're likely to still have an out-group that doesn't fit under their side of the house, meaning that government doesn't solve the problem. In fact, I think they actively make it worse because I think people are, if anything, are likely to be discriminated against more because A, these are niche or minorities at the moment that you split, right? That means that you don't have that common in-group to the same extent, but B, you have quantitatively less people who are similar, meaning you just have less support and less political capital. Now, why is it comparatively better under our side of the house? A, I think you have less division within these intersectionalities, right? So it's much more easy for minorities to band together and easier for people like you and me to rally behind common denominators that we share. This is not only quantitatively more within the groups of people you can interact with, but also percentage-wise more in the common denominators between you and me. So for example, I might bond with one of you guys, supposed to like Taylor Swift, I might bond with someone else because we're half Asian. Like, it doesn't really matter. The point is I have a choice between denominators that I align with, whereas on site government, that decision is made for you, so you have less access to those things. But B, note that you are not forced to choose between, like under our side, you are not forced to choose between two unfavorable options. Because you can still keep your family and your gay lover, for example, and we think that then is when we maximize choice, instead of the case that CG brings. But see, even if everyone keeps fighting, at least we try to solve the problem now, instead on their side, where inevitably you're going to fight anyways, and you've torn these families apart for absolutely no reason, and we also prevent the short-term riots that are going to happen within the process of this, because I'd be pretty terrified if I had to make these difficult decisions. Now, CG.
So, your groups that are inherently smaller are still going to be discriminated against in the status quo. To the extent that we most likely also have regions which is not going to be switched, where you're able to have access to
okay,
significantly
the difference here is mobility, right? The difference is I have the choice between opting in and opting out within these circuits, whereas on yours at the house, you don't have that if you're locked into one dimension, and other people around you are also locked into one dimension, which means empirically you are able to access these things less, and empirically, because those dimensions are by definition divisive, you're also able to qualitatively access it less. Now, why do we take it over CG? They bring a state power principle. There's an issue with this. The motion is not the junction of these principles, because there are moments where we take choice away and moments where we give extra choice. Why is this motion not the tipping point? Because we grant this principle when you have the ability to make a choice or when the outcome of the choice is good. Note that it's on the ability to make a choice because, for example, the state doesn't provide
provide me a choice between what drugs I take because my decision making is flawed. And know that fundamentally you cannot make this choice weighing off impossible dilemmas between your mixed race child or the entirety of the rest of your family, right? And even if you make that choice, you don't have information on other people's choices on whether or not they will accept you. So on the basis of choice, we think that their principle already falls. But on the second metric, in terms of the outcome of the choice, for example, I'm not allowed to choose murder, so the state power principle doesn't apply there. The harms that government wants to prevent still happen under their side, and conflict is inevitable. And even if you have this choice, you only exert it once, so that principle is still violated in the future. But also in terms of the outcome of your choice, when we take it away, like for example, me not being able to choose murder, the harms on their side are significantly worse to tear these families apart. For those reasons, you vote for closing opposition.